Okay, day 12. Today we are in Mark chapter 5.
And it's, you know what this is it's a Markan sandwich is what they call this.
Oh, okay.
And they being probably a few commentators.
Are there other sandwiches that are named after a person?
Is the Reuben named after someone named Reuben, or are Reubens named after the Reuben sandwich?
I mean, I'd like to think that there was a guy named Reuben before there was a Reuben.
The BLT, there might be someone named. Is it named? No, that one's just named after bacon, lettuce, and tomato.
Yeah, right.
Here's what I mean by the Markan sandwich.
Yeah, tell us.
Mark does this thing where sometimes he puts a story inside of a story. I think it happens again in Mark chapter 11, but it's happening here in Mark chapter 5. Two stories, one that happens in two parts on the outside, like the bread. And that's the story of this guy called Jairus, whose daughter's sick, and he wants Jesus to come and heal his daughter. But then in the middle of the beginning and end of that story is another story inside where while Jesus is walking to Jairus' house, there's a big crowd and there's a woman who's been sick for a long time that reaches out to receive healing from Jesus. So that's what we want to look at today, Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. And this is one of your favorite stories, right, Ben?
It is. I especially the one in the middle. Yeah, I love it. Okay, do you want to read or should I read?
I can read. Here we go.
Yeah, perfect.
It says this, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. And remember all the stuff we've been talking about, the relationship of the religious leaders towards Jesus? I think that's interesting to remember as we see what Jairus is about to do here. So it says Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live. And it says that Jesus went with him.
Right away, you see, first of all, you see desperation, right, from Jairus. Like, that's just a desperate situation he finds himself in. His daughter's sick. And then the other thing that is important to note, like you said, he's a religious leader. And instead of having the response of some of the other hard-hearted religious leaders, Jairus is like, his desperation has actually brought him to, and probably the stories he's heard has brought him to faith and humility. He's just humbling himself, just even as a leader, saying, I'm going to humble myself before Jesus because I believe that he could make the difference.
I think that one of the things that this story tries to teach us about is what faith looks like. And it's not that there's a specific physical posture to faith, but it does look like humility. It does look like desperation. It does look like I don't have it inside myself to do this. I don't have the strength, the power, or the technique. And so we see desperation both in Jairus, but then also in this middle story. So I'll just keep moving on. It says, a great crowd followed him, being Jesus, and thronged about him. And it says, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And so just to pause and just empathize with this woman for a second, she's got this sickness that's been in her life for years, and she's spent all of her money and it's not working. So now she's poor and she's sick, and she hears rumors that Jesus is in town and healing people. And she thinks, she doesn't even have the courage to get in front of Jesus. She just has the courage to grab the hem of his garment. Verse 27 says she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I just touch his garments, I'll be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And it's a funny question. So his disciples are like, you see, there's so many people around you. There's a crowd. Like, what do you mean? Who touched you? And it says in verse 32, and he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. And there's that posture again, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease.
Yeah. When I hear this story, just on the surface, oftentimes you can get so much from the story, like just the story of what's happening. And then what happens a lot of times is as we learn more of the cultural context of what's going on, then it actually even comes alive even more. So the compassion, the power, the validation of, in this crowd, I see you. I'm going to pause and call you daughter, and the power healed her is just amazing. But one of the things on the deeper level that I really love about this story is because this woman had internal bleeding, she had a sickness that she wasn't able to find a cure for, that would have excluded her in the day, in the Jewish cultural customs of the day, from even synagogue worship probably. And so there's this aspect of she's already really on the fringe. And this isn't the first person on the fringe that Jesus pauses for. He's already paused for the leper earlier. And he pauses for this woman. So that's partly why she's afraid. She's not supposed to be like out there in the public. And Jesus knows that. He kind of knows what happened right away. He goes, wait, something just happened. And she's afraid, but Jesus validates her and says, hey, you're free now.
Yeah. So we see like her faith enough to go through the crowd to grab his garment, but then all of this fear interact, and Jesus takes all the faith and all the fear and then dignifies her and calls her out and says, no, you're not staying on the margin. Yeah, I love that, dude. That's amazing. Go in peace, daughter. Oh, I love that language. Let's keep reading. Verse 35. So while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter's dead. So while this was happening, Jairus' daughter passed away. Why trouble the teacher any further, they asked. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, but sleeping. So they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said, little girl, I say to you, arise. And then Mark records it in Aramaic as well. It says, and immediately the girl got up and began walking. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat, which I always think is such an interesting detail to end on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's thoughtful of him, right? He's not just raising her from the dead. He's also saying now she's probably hungry.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Super practical.
Yeah.
First thing that stands out to me in that last section is there was enough faith early on to say, hey, Jesus should come to prevent my daughter from dying. And so they're like, hey, but now that she's dead, don't bother coming. But Jesus is kind of like, no, I've got power for that as well. And then he says he's just sleeping. Now, sleeping often means death. So like there's a cool wordplay going there. She's just sleeping. It's like, but he's saying like, no, this isn't death isn't too big for me either.
And that's really huge because and when you add it to what we've already seen about Jesus, it also starts to point to what he's revealing about himself, especially in this first half up to chapter 8, I think it is, of Mark. It's in chapter 2, he's saying to the guy, your sins are forgiven. In chapter 3 and 4, he's healing people. He's showing power over sickness. He's showing power over creation. And he's also freeing people from demons. And he's showing power over the devil. And then ultimately this culminates in him saying, hey, I also have power over death itself.
Yeah. And what the climax of the whole story of Mark is. So when we see miracles and some of these things, sometimes they're called signs and wonders. And what do signs do? Signs point us to somewhere else. And when God does miracles here, and then even in our life, in our world today, they're meant to point us to a future reality and a bigger truth. And in the story of Mark, these are all signposts to the ultimate miracle that Jesus is going to do through his death and resurrection on the cross. And Mark's going to tell us more about that. But through the death and resurrection of Jesus, what happens? He defeats sin. He defeats sickness. He defeats the devil, and he even defeats death. And that's why we say death has lost its sting. We don't have to be afraid of death because Jesus has gone into death, resurrected from it, and defanged death. He took the fangs, the sharpness, the edge out of death. And here we see a demonstration of that resurrection power, coming alive in the partnership with these people. They partner with their faith in the Jesus who has power over death to see a woman raised from the dead. It's amazing.
And I think what I'm reminded of as you end there and you speak about the not having to fear death is this whole story today is about fear and faith. And I love what you said earlier about this. Hey, he takes all the fear and he takes all the faith. And sometimes we have both. And it's this picture of like, but then what he does is he says, hey, look, the faith was worth it. And it just takes away the power of the fear. And so that's probably a great spot for today.
Yeah, that's an invitation for all of us to bring our faith, to bring our fear all mingled together and to bring it in front of Jesus.